Hi, I'm Paula. Well, I went for my first scan whenever I was 12 weeks pregnant, and there was a cyst on the back of the baby's neck, and they said that they were going to send me for more tests. They said that it could be cystic hygroma, and they told me not to go and look it up on Google, but of course as soon as I went home I went and looked it all up and seen all the horror stories and pictures. So after a couple of weeks they had said about the cystic hygroma, and the consultant offered me a termination. She said that she would need to get another doctor and herself, and they would sign off for the termination under my mental health. She said that I would have to go to my own doctor, and my doctor would have to say, he would have to write a letter and say that I wouldn't be able to cope having a disabled child. And she said, at this point, I was adamant that I wouldn't have had a termination. I didn't want it, but I was just curious to find out why she was offering this, because was my baby going to be really badly disabled? I just didn't know what the future was going to hold. So I remember one day I asked her how the termination would be done, and she said that they would give me a tablet to start the labour, and the baby would be born alive, and it would just be left until its heart stopped beating. She said that they would have to do that. I think she said they could do it before 20 weeks, because I think it was just before my big scan. I had to give them the answer if I wanted to have the termination or not. So she said that she would send me for the amniocentesis test, and that would come back whether the baby had Turner syndrome or Down syndrome. And again, she said, whenever I was going that day, she said, let's see how these results come back, and then you can decide whether you want to keep the baby or not. So we went for the amniocentesis test, and she had sent me 2 weeks too early, so I'd got my hopes up going for the test. Because of all the complications with the baby and all, I was worrying, should I do it or should I not do it? But it finally went up, and they sent me home again because it was too early. And then so I went back again 2 weeks later, and they done the amniocentesis test, told me I was having a boy, and they said that they would let me know the results in a couple of weeks. So they fast-tracked the results, and it came back that the baby didn't have Turner syndrome or Down syndrome, and it wasn't a boy, it was a girl. And I was having a perfectly healthy baby. So the pregnancy went on fine. They were keeping an eye on the cyst on the back of the baby's neck, because she still did have a bit of a cyst there, but as the baby grew, the cyst was going down. So went into labour, had the baby, and as soon as she was born and she came out, I just looked at her and said to myself, she has Down syndrome just because of her features. She just looked so strange. It's terrible to say, but she just didn't look, and she wasn't crying. And I remember lying on the bed and looking over, and she was in the wee thing, and the nurses were working with her, and I was just lying praying, please let her cry, because that's the first thing that you want, is for your baby to cry. It seemed like ages, but it probably was only not even a minute or so, and then she did cry. And they had to phone to get a doctor to come in, because there was no doctors in the hospital at that time of night. So as soon as the doctor came, they had to rush her to another hospital, and she was in the neonatal unit. So she was taken away, and I was there in the hospital on my own, and her daddy went on up to the hospital with her, because he didn't want her to be on her own. And she just lying there thinking, not having your baby in here and other people's babies around you crying, it was terrible. And I don't know, you just feel so alone, you just want your baby there. So after a couple of hours, I went home to my own house just to try and get sorted out, and then we went up to the hospital to go in to see Ellie in the neonatal, and just walking into the room and just seeing your baby there with all these wires coming out of her. It's awful. You couldn't even pick her up. You couldn't even hold her. All you could do was touch her hand. She had tubes coming out of her. She couldn't breathe properly. She had pneumonia. And the doctors they were saying that about her having dysmorphic features, and then they told us that she had Down syndrome. So we were trying to come to terms with her having Down syndrome. It was a really hard time for me and her daddy. knowing that we had a baby with Down syndrome. And then they came back about 3 days later and said, your baby isn't Down syndrome, but she has the syndrome. They were going to test her for this syndrome. Things just kept getting worse. Anytime you thought, I was thinking every day, people were asking me, when's the baby coming home? And I was saying, oh, she'll be home next week as soon as she starts to feed, because she couldn't take a bottle or a dummy. She was tube fed. And then they came and they told us that her white blood cells, your white blood cells should be down around about 11, but Ellie's were up to between 50 and 60. So they said that they thought that she had a type of leukemia that's related to this other syndrome called Neonatal syndrome. So they were going to test Ellie for Neonatal syndrome, but they wanted to wait a couple of weeks to test. They wanted to wait a couple of weeks to test for the leukemia to see if her white blood cells would come back down themselves. So we were still in limbo. We didn't know if she had a syndrome, but the doctors just kept using the words, she has dysmorphic features, she has a syndrome, but we don't know what syndrome. She was 12 days old the very first time I got to hold her, and even though she was attached to all these wires, it was, I don't know, it was just great getting to hold your baby for the first time, and me and her daddy was fighting over who was going to hold her first, but I got to hold her first. And then she got home after 6 weeks. She got home at 6 weeks old. So they said that she could come home, and before they would let her home, I had to learn how to put the tube in up her nose and then test it and everything. And that was awful. See just going down to put just the initial trying to get it in her nose and what way to do it. It was awful just seeing it. I thought it was bad whenever I was seeing other people doing it, but whenever I had to do it, it was terrible. So she was home about 2 weeks. She was about 8 weeks old, and we had to take her up to haematology in the hospital. They wanted to do some more tests on her for the leukemia. And we went up, and as soon as we went into the hospital, and the doctor looked at her and she said, she's not right, she's not breathing properly. She was just really concerned about her heart. So she didn't even do any blood tests, she just sent us straight up to Clark Clinic, there's the heart clinic, and they kept her in straight away. They put her on the monitor. She was having like irregular heart rhythms and stuff. And then she got really, really sick. She took something called NEC. I don't know the proper words for NEC. But she ended up in intensive care. Before she went to intensive care, they took her into theatre. They had to give her a central line, because whenever you have NEC, you can't have any food. You can only have water, or TPN it's called, you can only have, but she needed a central line in, and they took her into theatre to try and get the central line. That was the first time she'd ever really went under anaesthetic, and they must have tried about 15 times in this side of the neck, 15 times in this side of the neck, and then both sides of the groins to try and get the central line, and they couldn't get it in. So they sent her back down to the ward, and then the next day they sent her back up again to try and get the central line in, and a different surgeon done it, and he got it in first time. But because her heart was so bad, they couldn't get her off the ventilator, so she ended up in intensive care for about 5 days, and it was awful. See, walking in to the room just to see her, I walked over to the cot where she was, and I looked in the cot, and I turned and walked away, and the nurse said to me, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm looking for Ellie here," and she said, "That's her there." And I said, "That's not Ellie," and she says, "It is." I said, "It's not." And she walked over with me and she says, "That's Ellie." She was so swollen, it just didn't look like my wee baby at all. It was terrible, and they had her 2 wee arms tied down to the bed because she was trying to bring her arms up to pull the ventilator out, and it was awful. So 5 days later she recovered from the neck, and she was brought back down to Clark Clinic. They then done a bone marrow on her, where they went into, I think it was the bottom of her, I don't know if it's the bottom of her spine, somewhere there, but they didn't put her asleep. They just gave her gel to freeze her and screwed whatever into her back to get the bone marrow out to see if she had that type of leukemia, and it came back that she had this type of leukemia. But the type of leukemia that she had, she didn't need any treatment for it. They said that they would just monitor it and see how she went with it. They said that her white blood cells would come down themselves without any treatment. So while she was in Clark Clinic, we were told that she had pulmonary valve stenosis, PDA, cardiomyopathy and ASD. The cardiomyopathy that there is to do with the muscles around the heart. There's 4 chambers in the heart, and one of the chambers in Ellie's heart had a muscle going around it, and that chamber was working harder, so the doctor said that that's okay. That's the reason why that muscle is bigger. But the other chamber, the muscle was getting harder, and he just said that they didn't know why this muscle was growing, and he said that if that muscle got any bigger, then they wouldn't be able to do anything for her. His word, I always remember his words to me were, if this gets any bigger, then it's going to be catastrophic for her. And hearing them words about your baby, you just never think that it's going to happen to you. And I thought that was the worst of it. But then they told us that they would do surgery on her, but before the surgery, before they'd done the open heart surgery, they wanted to do a catheterization, cardiac catheterization on her. That there's where they go in through the groin, the main vein in the groin, and push like a catheter type thing up into the heart with the balloon, and then the balloon opens the valve in her heart. So we went to the hospital and they took her to theatre and they done that. But that didn't work. As soon as whenever they open the balloon, that's meant to keep the valve open. But whenever they took the balloon away, Ellie's valve just flopped back down again. And that there's really common in babies with Noonan syndrome, so that we still hadn't got the results back then if she had Noonan syndrome, but everything that was wrong with Ellie was leading to Noonan syndrome. So the catheter op didn't work, so then they said that they would have to do the open heart surgery. That was in the January time, and then we found out that they told us that she did have Noonan syndrome. And me and her daddy both got tested to see if we were carriers of it, but we're not. It was spontaneous. So in April they said that they were going to do the open heart surgery on her, and we had to meet with the surgeon. We met with the surgeon and he was going through all the pros and cons of the operation for her. And I had to sign the paper, so I signed it, and he just took the paper in his hand and he says, you know, if she doesn't have this operation, she's going to be dead in a year. And see, hearing that, you don't want your baby to go through surgery, you don't want your baby to die, you just want your baby to be normal. And already in my head, my wee baby wasn't normal. She wasn't the baby. She was just a sick wee baby, and she wasn't the baby that I had dreamed of having. So basically he told us that she would be dead in a year because her heart was so bad and she needed this surgery. And we went 2 weeks later for her to get the surgery. She had actually got a cancellation, and then they said that they weren't going to do the surgery on her because she had a bit of a cold, and then they told us that they would do it in 2 weeks' time. So we went back to the hospital. She was getting the surgery on the Monday, and we went on the Friday for her to get the surgery, or for her to go in. And the doctor done these tests. They were doing the final tests before the surgery on the Friday, and we were sitting in the room, and the doctor came into the room and he just walked in the room and he went like that and he says, I give up. And I looked at him and I said, what do you mean? He says, I give up on her. And me and her daddy were like, what do you mean? He said, her heart is mending itself. He said, I've just sat there in a room with 4 of my colleagues and we're trying to think of a scientific explanation to tell you why this heart is the way it is. He said, and we can't understand it. So the doctor, he told us all that, and he said she doesn't need this surgery. And we couldn't believe it. I sort of just sat there laughing and looking at her daddy, and we just couldn't understand it. But the whole church has been praying. Someone actually says to me, do you know what? Your baby's got better because of your daddy. Because your daddy has the world praying for her. And do you know what? That's true, because she is a miracle. She's my miracle, and she's my gift from God, and God has given her to me. People always used to say to me, God's not going to give you something you can't handle. And I used to say, I can't see all this sickness, everything that she's getting. How are we going to get through all this? You just feel so hopeless, so helpless, seeing your child lying there and you can't do anything for her. It's so hard to explain the hurt that you have inside. But God has healed her. God has brought her through more than we ever thought that God was going to bring her through. I remember before crying and saying, God, why did you do this? Why is this why is it happening to me? Obviously it wasn't me, it's Ellie going through it. She's stronger, she's the strongest one out of us all. But God's healed her, and he's done big things in her life, and he's going to keep doing big things through her life. He's making me see things in a different light. Before, I would have walked past someone who had a disabled child and not had a second thought about them. But see now, I think deep into things, deep into people, and Ellie has really changed me, and she's just a miracle and a blessing. She's able to do things that other children are doing. She's running about, shouting. She knows how to get what she wants. She's a spoilt wee cat. But she's just as normal as she can be. She loves playing with toys, she loves singing, she loves dancing, she loves coming to church. She waves away at her granddad in church. She's just a wee dream. One of the doctors said a couple of months ago, she came walking into the room and Ellie was sitting up on her own. And even for Ellie to be sitting up on her own, that doctor said, oh my goodness, I can't believe Ellie, her sitting up. She says, I never expected to see that. And just anything the doctors see, they can't believe that she's doing it so quick. She's coming to, and she's only started walking. She can't talk or anything. She doesn't eat. She's tube fed. She's starting to take wee taste, but she's never had a bottle in her life. She's never had a drink of anything. But she's getting there. It will be a slow process, but it's not as hard as what we thought it was going to be. And people always say to me, how can you cope with everything, with what you have to do with her and all? But you get used to it, and you have to do it. No one else can do it for you. She's my wee baby, and God gave her to me. And I love her to bits. And all the help that I have around me, that's a big part in it as well. I have a great family support and great friends, and everyone's there for me. And Ellie's a wee special girl. Obviously, I'm at this point now where I'm happy that Ellie has got to where she has got, but there is people out there who are going for scans, and the doctors often are offering them terminations, and they're going for this termination. But do you know what? Look where Ellie has come from. See, if someone had told me this whenever I was pregnant, I wouldn't have believed them. I wouldn't have said, how can God do this? How can this have happened to your baby? And because you want to blame someone, but we've got there, and I would never ever have listened to anyone saying to me, don't you worry, you'll get there, because that's all people think when they say, oh, you'll be all right, you'll get there, she'll make it. They will make it, because Ellie's made it. And if Ellie has made it, if Ellie can make it, your child can make it, and you can make it.